Hello. Wait a couple minutes just for it to test. Let's see. Hello, hello, hello. Test, test, test. Uh-oh. For some reason, my YouTube on my laptop is automatically set to quarter speed. Alright, that sounds like things are working. That's good. Alright. Let us begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Schubert, founder and chair at Amending America. And today we are covering the second chapter of the compendium. This is the second chapter of the colonial era, and it is called Nova Britannia, and it covers the years 1603 to 1675. And this chapter is divided into sections, 4 sections, and each section has its own interactive timeline of primary source documents and events, so people can more easily learn about what happened during these different time periods. And so the first section is called the Jacobean Age, and it covers the reign of James I of England, 1603 to 1625. He ascends to the throne following the death of Queen Elizabeth I, which we covered in yesterday's live stream, which covered chapter 1. And so this is the start of the Stuart dynasty. Elizabeth was the last of the Tudor dynasty. Now we're into the Stuart dynasty. And we're mostly going to be focusing on what's happening in the Americas. You know, this is a very important time for at least the English colonies, the development and really the start of the English colonies. But we're also going to be including what's going on in Europe in order to give context to what else is happening in the world and what motivates some European powers to do certain things during this time period. We have things like the 30 Years' War going on. We have the English Civil War that happens, and many more global conflicts, which we're going to mention. We don't go into too much detail. We just have it so that people can see like what else is going on while the founding of the English colonies is happening. And so we begin with the ascension of James I as king, which happens March 24th, 1603, upon the death of Elizabeth I. Now, during the Elizabethan age, you have a lot of religious conflict. And so Elizabeth, she establishes the Church of England with the Act of Supremacy, and she will try to regulate or episcopalize, if that's the right term, the Church of England in order to reconcile the Catholics and the more Protestant elements like the Presbyterians in England. And so the Episcopal Church, or Episcopalians, will come from that tradition, from the Anglican tradition. And so we have some petitions for religious reforms in England. James I, following Edward VI's example, will pass a act banishing vagabonds to Newfoundland and the West Indies. And so you have to keep in mind there's something very, very important going on in England. Like, I cannot stress this enough how important the enclosure movement is for not only the development of England into the world's first industrial power, but also the settlement of the New World. And so you have to understand what the enclosure movement is. The enclosure movement, so in England, you have land that's owned by masters, the lords, and the king. And you also have common land or public land that the people can live on and they can use whatever natural resources are on that land for themselves. Now, common land was organized under the church, and when Henry VIII dissolves the monasteries, he encloses the lands, the common land around the monasteries that he now takes for himself, in order to sell it to the lords of England in order to make a lot of money. And so the king is selling out his own people, the land, the resources, the natural resources, which will be completely cleared and replaced by sheep herding, because wool is a very high value commodity at this time. And so lords are buying these enclosed lands from the king that was originally communal or common land. And so now you have a bunch of people who don't like aristocrats, and their only material livelihood is taken from them. The land and the resources on that land is taken from them. They have to go somewhere. Some of them, a lot of them, in fact, most of them, go to the cities. And so this will create a boom in the population of cities, and it's in the cities where that kind of labor, masterless workers, will have to be reorganized, which will be the invention of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So the enclosure movement, kicking the people off their own land, forcing them to reorganize in cities, has a tremendous impact on England becoming the first industrial country, because no other country is doing something like this. The enclosure movement is a uniquely English institution, if you can call it that. It's you don't see it happening in France, you don't see it happening in Spain, you don't see it happening anywhere that I have learned about. And so learning, why the English become the first industrial power, it's because of the enclosure movement. At least that's the theory that the research that I've done will suggest. Now, many of those people, the people who were dispossessed by the enclosure movement, kicked off the land that their family and their ancestors lived on, the common land, without an aristocrat, without a master. A lot of these people are actually going to be traveling and migrating to the New World. And so people wonder, like, why were the American colonies so anti-aristocratic? Why didn't we have lords over here? We had the closest thing to a lord was a proprietor of a colony, but there were only a handful of proprietors. And most colonies would be royal colonies because the proprietary-ships were complete failures, especially the Virginia one. And so the kinds of people that come from England are people who traditionally did not have a master, an aristocrat over them, who lived on communal land in a tight-knit religious community. And these are the kinds of people who will, en masse, during this chapter, will flee England, especially during the reign of Charles I, and they will settle the New World, and they will create communal institutions with a proto-democratic element to it, very similar to the communal living conditions of before the enclosure movement took their land. And so that's the theory that I am running with, that the research will suggest. That the reason why the American colonies were so anti-aristocratic and even anti-monarchical is because the monarch sold off his own people to the aristocrats to make money. And the aristocrats displaced these people, the common folk, in order to clear the land to make sheep herds and make money selling wool and support the textile industry. And that increased wool supply also contributes to industrialization, since the textile industry is one of the first industrial industries of this time. So it's all like merge, like industrial revolution is emerging out of these institutions and these actions in England. And so understanding the mechanics of a nation's development is something that I'm very interested in learning more about, not just vague statements like, oh, the English people were, more industrious or more innovative. Like, no, there's actual material conditions that lead to the development of England as the first industrial power. And so this act from James I, banishing vagabonds to the Newfoundland, is going to contribute to the people who used to live on communal land that was now enclosed and sold off to the aristocrats. They're now vagabonds, and so many of them are going to be kicked out and sent to the New World. And many of them will go willingly to the New World. At the same time, the French will start their colonial project. The Spanish monarchy, or the Spanish Navy Armada, has been soundly defeated at the Battle of Gravelines just 20 years prior. Not even 20 years prior, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And so that opened up the opportunity for other European powers to colonize the New World. The English take advantage of it, the French, the Dutch, even Sweden, and a few other European powers will attempt to establish their own colonies, England being the most successful of the European powers to settle the New World, especially at this time. And so here's more religious shenanigans going on in England. James I will address Puritan grievances. The Puritans are people who want the Church of England to be purified from any Catholic influence. And so James I, who is Scottish, and I forget if he was somewhat Catholic or maybe Presbyterian, on top of being before being king of England, becoming the head of the Church of England. And so I'll have to look that up. But James I will create, in order to try to placate the Puritans and other Anglicans, the King James Bible. Here's the Treaty of London, which is between Spain and England, which ended the Anglo-Spanish War. And even though on the timeline the fighting has already been over for the past couple of, I guess, 1.5 years during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. So the Anglo-Spanish War is the main conflict during Queen Elizabeth's the first reign between the English and the Spanish. And so the Spanish Armada was part of that war. The French are, again, at this time, establishing their own colonies, their own settlements. You have the gunpowder plot uncovered by Guy Fawkes. The conspirators were led by Guy Fawkes to try to blow up Parliament, which was a thing that might have happened. Here is the first charter of Virginia, and so this was issued in 1606. It'll be a year for the actual settlement to be the first settlement of Virginia, the Jamestown settlement, to be established. Here's the Newport voyage, first voyage of the Virginia Company to find a place to settle. And while the start of the settlement of the colonization by the English, you have things like the Midland Riots, which is a series of peasant revolts starting around 1607. And again, these peasants are mad that their public land, the common land, was enclosed and sold to private landowners, depriving the people of natural space and resources, and many were forced to live in the cities. And so, while the very beginning of the English settlement of the New World, we have the height of the enclosure movement will happen under Charles the First, the next monarch, but we have the enclosure movement contributing to peasant revolts and also peasant migration out of England to the New World. We have, during the voyage, the Newport voyage, we have John Smith. He is arrested for attempted usurpation while on the ship the Susan Constant. A lot of these events, especially centered around John Smith, comes from a primary source written by John Smith in the 1620s, and we have that document on this timeline. And so a lot of these events are from that document. Let's see, the Virginia voyage, that's the Newport voyage, reaches the West Indies around March of 1607. And then around April, the end of April 1607, the colonists first anchor in the Chesapeake. And then on May 13th, 1607, Jamestown is established. Very, very quickly, the Jamestown settlement will come under attack and by the Algonquin tribes. Following the attack, Fort James, which is what this painting depicts, this is Fort James, is constructed. Of course, it would have been smart to have the fort before the attack. John Smith is released as a prisoner and joins the council. He becomes a leader in the colony. John Ratcliffe will become a very important leader, the president of the colony. And the colony itself is actually a company, the Virginia Company, and most of the shareholders are members of Parliament. So colonies are actually companies owned by members of Parliament and led by some of these settlers. So it's a mix of Parliament's authority, private capital investment, and also the adventurous colonists themselves, who take most matters into their own hands, given how far away they are from England. And within just a few months, by October, half the colony is dead, and mostly by a sickness. Based on John Smith's own writing, he has a mock execution of himself by the Powhatan. Powhatan is a chieftain of a local tribe. John Smith returns to the colony, and then he is accused of murder and sentenced to be hanged, and then charges are dropped when resupply arrives. So he's arrested during the voyage to the New World. He then gets captured by natives and has a mock trial and a mock execution. And now he gets accused of murder and is sentenced to be hanged, but then the charges are dropped. So John Smith is, if those things actually happened, he is very lucky. A massive fire happened at the start of 1608. John Smith will start to explore the Chesapeake and survey the land in order to find out what the natural resources are in order to help the colony thrive. The French are also founding more and more settlements, like Quebec. Here's the second voyage of John Smith. John Smith will become the president of the council. in England, you will have people who have investments in the Virginia company, and they will write these pamphlets in order to encourage as many people from England to move to the New World. And so this is an example of one of those uh, sermons slash pam. It's like a promotional material for the New World. Let's see. Here's another example of that. During this time, you have the Second Charter of Virginia, Gates Voyage, which will be an attempt to resupply the Jamestown settlement, but supplies are held back by the environment. One of the last settlements of the Spanish in the New World, in North America, I should say, what would become the United States, is at Santa Fe. The French themselves are having their own conflicts with local natives, like the Battle on Lake Champlain. The colonists, English colonists, are also not having luck with the natives, and they start to fight each other as well. And the first Powhatan War begins. That first Anglo-Powhatan War begins. Here's another promotional pamphlet for settling the New World in England. Let's see. More supplies and more settlers arrive to Jamestown. Some more violence between natives and the Jamestown colonists during the First Anglo-Powhatan War. Oh, excuse me. The Third Charter of Virginia attempts to reorganize the colony because the colony is not doing so good right now. The King James Bible is published in 1611. So Thomas Dale arrives in Jamestown to become the governor. He, Thomas Dale, will be the one to publish the laws, divine, moral, and martial, which are very important, especially in Virginia at this time. And it's an interesting read to see what they thought the morals were, what they thought law should be during this time period. And so for a document like this, we have a read document button. And when you click on the read document button, it will take you to the full text of that document that we have. And we also try to include images of the authors and provide a little annotation on the side. And so if you're interested in reading the full text of this document, it's a pretty decently long document. You can straight from the timeline. Matthias becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and this is important for the 30 Years' War, which is about to begin, which is a religious conflict in Central Europe, which is the Holy Roman Empire. Sometime in April 1613, Pocahontas is abducted. She is around 11, I think, when she is abducted, and she will marry next year to John Rolfe, and their marriage will help make a peace settlement between the Powhatan and the Virginia colony, the Jamestown settlement, which happens sometime in 1614. Here's the Charter of New Netherland. This is the Dutch Republic. They're going to be establishing their own colonies, and their most famous colony that they set up is going to be New York. what would become New York, which for them was New Netherlands. Here is the French. They have an expedition. What's happening in other parts of the world? We have Galileo. He is facing the Inquisition. This is in 1616, and here's a painting from 1857 of that event. So if anyone's interested in when Galileo was doing his stuff, it's during this time. You have the defenestration of Prague. This is pretty much the spark of the Bohemian phase of the 30 Years' War. And so, again, it's a religious conflict in the Holy Roman Empire that happens simultaneously with, or really ends with, the English Civil War as well at the same time. So the Peace of Westphalia is signed right around the same time as Charles I being executed. Here is a very early document, or very early prime minister's document of the Virginia colony. This was made on July 30th, 1619. It is when the House of Burgesses first meets and passes the first resolves of the colony. And so this is a very important institution. The House of Burgesses will last for over 150 years and make it to the American Revolution as the colonial legislature of Virginia. Ferdinand II becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he is elected Holy Roman Emperor during the, I just said it, 30 Years' War. Another event that happened in 1619 that people like to bring up excuse me, is the first African slaves sold in Virginia. And so this is the first recording of African slaves, which, if you read the report, it was like a British pirate. He steals a Spanish ship that had slaves, and he needed food, and so he goes to Virginia to sell the slaves to get food, and the Virginians agree because they're short on labor, and so this is the first time that African slaves are sold in Virginia. It is not the first time that African slaves are in the Americas. That happens all the way back around 1501. So over 100 years before this, you had African slaves in the New World, thanks to the Spanish and the Portuguese. You have the Plymouth expedition, which will include what would become known as the Mayflower Compact, along with the Charter of New England. So the Mayflower Compact is an agreement signed by the passengers of the Mayflower on November 11th, 1620, before they disembarked at Plymouth. That's Plymouth, England. The ordinances for Virginia. This is the Virginia Company trying to reorganize the colony itself. This is when the infamous Powhatan Massacre of Virginia happens. 347 English colonists are murdered, which is about a quarter of the colony's population, including a college of mixed Native American and white students. And so you have to keep in mind, most schools at this time are seminaries, and so they are teaching religion. And part of colonizing the New World is to bring Christianity to Native Americans. And so there were many Native Americans who willingly accepted Christianity. There were a lot who didn't willingly accept Christianity. And so it's very interesting that we don't really have animosity between the natives and the colonists on something like race. That isn't a problem. The colonists are willing to welcome the Native Americans. Race isn't really a factor at this time. Um, it's mostly national loyalty, like which monarch are you loyal to, and also what religion do you follow. So, monarchical loyalty and religion are the most important, uh, I guess, identities that people have. Race would come in later. More English colonies are to be established, like Maine, which will be joined with Massachusetts and then later separated again. And then we have another incident of the this was a Spanish treasure galleon that sunk from a hurricane, and we actually found the wreckage and brought some of the stuff out. So this is what a cannon on a ship looked like in 1620. In 1622, you have this act passed by James the First, or I guess it's a proclamation, which is trying to regulate trade. So pretty early on in the English colonial history, the monarch is trying to regulate trade, which, if you know anything about American Revolution, that will come to bite the British later. Let's see. English colonists feared that a peace meeting was going to be interrupted by a mass poisoning, and so the English will kill around 200 Powhatan people, and whether or not this poisoning actually happened, we don't know, but some contemporary sources say that the poisoning didn't happen at all. And here's the primary source that I mentioned earlier with John Smith. He wrote the General History of Virginia. As you can see, it has a much longer title. And this is the main primary source that we use for most of the events that happen at the founding of Jamestown. From the founding of Jamestown to the First Anglo-Powhatan War, a lot of that history is written here. The Dutch, they will have success capturing Salvador from the Portuguese, which at this time, Portugal and Spain are united in the Iberian Union. And so, this is just a continuation of the decline of the Spanish Empire as other European powers start to have more success and establish a foothold in the New World, like the English, the French, and the Dutch. Because of the failures of the Virginia colony from the First and Second Powhatan Wars, and also the mass starvation and the very low amount of profit coming from the colony, James I decides to revoke the Virginia Charter and make the colony a royal colony, which will be under the direct authority of the king and parliament. And James I will encourage the growth of tobacco plantations in Virginia. He'll make a couple of these proclamations right before he dies on March 27th, 1625. So all that has just been the first section of this timeline. Now we go into the Caroline Age, which covers the reign of Charles I. He will follow James I, and all the problems during James I's reign are going to become much worse. The enclosure movement will become a bigger problem in England, which will contribute, along with other things, to the English Civil War. The colonies will continue fighting conflicts with Native Americans, and the colonies will actually start to fight conflicts between each other, especially during the English Civil War, as some colonies will be loyal to Parliament and other colonies will be more loyal to the king, like Barbados and Maryland. And so all the problems during James I will continue and get worse during Charles I's reign. And so Charles I will continue to try to assert royal dominance over some of the colonies like Virginia. He will marry Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic. This is one of many contributing factors to the English Civil War, as many Puritans in Parliament will fear the Catholic influence from his wife. And again, during this time, the 30 Years' War is going on, and so we try to keep track of all the important battles of that war, even though it doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on English history or the American colonies at this time. William Laud becomes the Bishop of London, yet another contributing factor to the English Civil War. William Laud will try to pass religious reforms, which will anger the Puritans. The Dutch, they will establish their what would become New York City, which for them will be New Netherlands, and they purchased Manhattan from Native Americans in 1626. Here is the Charter of Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1628. So it's always fascinating to see a primary source document, like an image of the actual document from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that we can actually still have and see and read. Here's another voyage for the Massachusetts Bay Company. Parliament will propose the Petition of Right, which is a petition to limit royal authority over taxation and imprisonment, and this will be yet another contributing factor to the English Civil War, as Parliament will try to assume more authority, and the king will try to enforce his royal prerogative over Parliament when it comes to raising money and passing laws, and even imprisoning members of Parliament, which is a big no-no to Parliament. So much so that Charles will dissolve Parliament and begin his personal rule in 1629. Then you have the Edict of Restitution, which again is a 30 Years' War development that we just keep track of. You have the Charters of Freedoms and Exemptions, which is a Dutch document for the structure and freedom of their colonists in the New World. Here's the Charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company to establish Massachusetts as a Puritan colony. And in order to settle, for the Puritans to settle, they sent John Winthrop in order to create the first Massachusetts or first Puritan colony for the express purpose of being a Puritan colony. And this is the Winthrop voyage. Fun fact for my family, I have a direct ancestor who was on the Arabella, the flagship of the Winthrop fleet that came over in 1630. So this document is the daily journal of Winthrop for his voyage, and we also have the Sermon of the Christian Charity by John Winthrop. This is a very famous speech that John Winthrop gives. This is where he coins the term "city on a hill," not "shining city on a hill." That's Ronald Reagan. He will add the word "shining" to it. It's originally just a city on a hill for the rest of the world to look upon as an example of Christian, specifically Puritan, success. Sweden enters the 30 Years' War at this time under Gustavus Adolphus. Here is the Charter of Maryland, granted by Charles I in order to create a Catholic colony. And so it's interesting. Parliament, they established Massachusetts to be a Puritan colony, while pretty much the same time, Charles I is establishing a Catholic colony. And so this is yet another contributing factor to the English Civil War between the Puritans and the Catholic influence. During this time, Galileo is doing his thing, and he's getting harassed by the Inquisition of the Holy Office in Italy. William Laud, the Bishop of London, now becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he begins aggressive enforcement of ceremonial conformity, which goes against Puritan beliefs. So the Church of England was episcopalized by Elizabeth I, and that was continued by James I and now Charles I, and this will become a problem. And yet another leading factor of the English Civil War, because the Episcopal tradition is very Catholic looking compared to, like, when it comes to all the ceremony and how you're supposed to do Mass, versus the Puritans, which are very simple. There isn't an altar with, golden chalices or the crucifixion or stuff like that for the Puritans. And so this is yet another leading factor to the English Civil War, which is mainly a religious conflict, but also a conflict between authority of Parliament versus the authority of the King of England. Here's the Maryland expedition. More regulation for controlling the plantations in the New World. And then around 1635 is the peak of the Puritan migration. This period is known as the Great Migration, and it is many Puritans fleeing England during the reign of Charles I. Many of these Puritans are also people who lost their property from the enclosure movement, but under Charles I, it becomes more of a religious issue as opposed to the land issue under James I. France will join the 30 Years' War against Spain, while the German Protestant states will reconcile, and this ends the Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War. In the colonies, you have the Pequot War going on starting in 1636, a conflict between the Pequot tribe and their alliance, and an alliance of English colonists from Massachusetts, Plymouth, Saybrook, along with their native allies, over control of trade and territory in southern New England. You have the New Haven voyage, led by John Davenport and Theophilus Eaton, to establish New Haven, Connecticut, as a Bible commonwealth. So there's a lot of Puritan activity going on, especially in New England, during this time period. Ferdinand III becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he will begin to negotiate peace for the 30 Years' War. Let's see, this is Charles I's proclamation regulating immigration to America. And so this is him, again, the English trying to encourage as much migration from England to the New World as possible. A interesting document called the Declaration in Defense of an Order of Court is in the Massachusetts Bay. You have the antinomian, I can't say these words, controversy in Massachusetts Bay, and so John Winthrop authored a declaration in defense of an order of court to justify a recent order restricting the admission of new settlers into the colony without approval from colonial authorities. And so John Winthrop wants to establish more of a barrier from new colonists entering the colony. This is an attempt to prevent disputes, especially religious disputes, as more religious diversity starts to show up in the New World, as more colonists from various religious backgrounds start to show up. During the Pequot War, a very infamous event happens, which is the Mystic Massacre, and around 500 Pequot people, mostly civilians, are killed in a single night. You have the New Sweden voyage, where Swedish settlers will arrive in the Delaware Valley, and although Sweden will not have a successful colony, it is interesting to note that other European powers than the usual four or five that most people talk about, Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, the Dutch, there were other European powers also trying to establish colonies as well. Here's Charles I having more regulations, of course, over the colonies. And then the Treaty of Hartford will end the Pequot War. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which establishes a unified colonial government of the towns of Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield, to create a unified Connecticut colony. New Haven will do a similar thing as well. Treaty of Berwick, which is concluded between Charles I and the Scottish Covenanters, led to a brief peace ending the First Bishops' War, and this peace will not last long when the English Civil War breaks out, which happens next. And so we start the history of the English Civil War in 1640. We include the Short Parliament, where Charles I recalls Parliament, and then tries to raise taxes. Excuse me. Tries to raise taxes and fails to do so. And so he dissolves Parliament after only a few weeks. But then he has to recall Parliament again, which is the start of the Long Parliament, which is one of the longest parliaments in English history. It begins in 1640. It'll last until the end of the Interregnum. And so, let's see, government of Rhode Island is established as a colony. The execution of Thomas Wentworth, a subordinate of Charles I. He tries to arrest a few members of Parliament. He himself gets arrested and then executed. And Parliament sends the Grand Remonstrance. Remonstrance just means protest to Charles I in order to present to him a list of grievances presented to the king. Sound familiar? A list of grievances to the king that leads to a war. Might sound familiar. And then you have the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which is now... So the colonies are now adopting their own documents without the direct approval of the king or Parliament to help govern themselves. And so, because of the English Civil War, the king and Parliament will be distracted and focusing on what's happening in England and then in Europe, and will practice something called salutary neglect of the colonies. And the colonies during this time period will become much more independent and develop their own laws, their own liberties, their own systems of governance and institutions without direct parliament or parliamentary or monarchical authority. Charles I attempts to arrest members of Parliament, but these members will flee. Here's a pretty interesting looking painting of that event. After the failure to arrest the members of Parliament that he wanted to arrest, Charles I flees, fearing that he would be captured. And it's while Charles I is away from London that he will accuse Parliament of rebellion, and then Parliament passes the Militia Ordinance, and then Charles I issues the Commissions of Array, calling upon local gentry to raise forces in support of the crown. And in 1642, Charles I will declare war on Parliament. So you have this building up conflict between the king and Parliament. The king wants to raise money to fight wars. He also wants to regulate religion and make things more Episcopalian as opposed to the Puritans. And Parliament, who at this time is mostly Puritan, are going to be against those reforms. They're against the raising of the money. Many members of Parliament, especially House of Commons, are against the enclosure movement, which Charles I expands upon and contributes to the migration into the New World, and all this building tension, religious issues, economic issues, authority issues, will now explode as the English Civil War. And this begins on August 22nd, 1642. Then you have the Battle of Powhatan Bridge. This is the first significant clash of the English Civil War, and it is a royalist victory, but it is followed pretty quickly by the first major pitched battle of the English Civil War, where the battle was inconclusive and shows that pretty early on that the war is not going to be over quickly, that it's going to be a very long war. Similar things happen with like the Civil War with the Battle of Manassas. People think it's just going to be a simple, easy Union victory, and then when it's not, it's like, oh, all right, this is going to be a much bloodier and longer conflict than anyone thinks. Then you have the Articles of Confederation of the United Colonies of New England. And so the colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth Colony, Connecticut Colony, and New Haven Colony adopt on their own these Articles of Confederation. Sound familiar? You know, all like the founding of our country, especially, is like repeating history. Like the, Massachusetts Body of Liberties, or the Grand Remonstrance, or the Articles of it's actually called the Articles of Confederation, and of course this will have a direct influence on the Articles of Confederation that will be created 100 and almost 130 years after this, during the American Revolution. So history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. There's another battle of the English Civil War. The Solemn League of Covenant. So the English Parliament, which are Puritans, will make this covenant with the Scottish in order to cooperate and have like a temporary military alliance to oppose the Episcopalian forces of Charles I during the English Civil War. The agreement secured Scottish military assistance for Parliament in exchange for a commitment to reform religion in England along a more Presbyterian model. So the Scottish are Presbyterians, the Parliament at this time are Puritans, and then the authority of Charles I, he's more Episcopalian. He has the Church of England, which is more Episcopalian, and also has some Catholic influence. So you have this three-way war happening where two sides are now fighting one side, and that will flip pretty later on in the English Civil War. Here's the government of New Haven. Again, the colonies at this time are now establishing their own colonial documents, as opposed to just receiving everything from the king and parliament. And in fact, at this time, 1643, Charles I will force the colonies to be, proclaim loyalty to himself. And so this is yet another example of the king forcing the colonies to do something that many of the colonies, especially the New England colonies, which are more Puritan, will refuse to do. And it is during the English Civil War, again, a religious conflict, where you have people like Roger Williams. He publishes this pamphlet, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, the cause of conscience, discussed in a conference between truth and peace. And he is advocating for religious liberty, seeing that the Civil War was caused by a religious conflict. He wants to separate the authority of civil authority from the religious authority in order to... It's not necessarily a separation of church and state, but it is an advocacy for more religious freedom in order to prevent religious conflicts like the English Civil War. There's another important battle of the English Civil War, the Battle of Marston Moor, and the Battle of Naseby. That's an important battle. During this time, John Winthrop will give his little speech on liberty, and I have a video of me reading the speech. And this is a reflection on the nature of freedom in Massachusetts Bay. And John Winthrop will distinguish between natural liberty, which he associates with disorder and moral license, and covenant liberty, which he argued was ordered freedom within the bounds of divine and communal law. So, if you know anything about civic theory at this time, you have Hobbes, he writes his famous Leviathan in the next section during the Interregnum, but Hobbes is not the originator of what we call Hobbesian philosophy, civic philosophy, where you have this state of nature and natural liberty, and then you have the state of being in a society and the liberty that comes with that. That distinction, which is a distinction that I don't really see many people talk about nowadays. People don't really talk about natural liberty being separate from civil liberty. And although I personally am more of, in line with this kind of civic philosophy of Winthrop and Hobbes, I'm not a complete Hobbesian. I don't believe in supporting a monarchy, but at least when it comes to the philosophy of governance of natural, the state of nature and then the state of civility, that part of the philosophy I agree with. And so Hobbes isn't the only person who believes this. People like John Winthrop also believe this. Charles I, he surrenders in 1646 to the Scots, and he will try to get the Scots to join his side, but that fails. And so the Scots hand Charles I to Parliament. Charles escapes captivity, but is quickly recaptured and by Parliament. And you have one of the last battles of this phase of the English Civil War, which is the Battle of Preston, and they defeat the Royalist and Scottish Engager army. And so Charles I, he tries to recruit the Scots, the Presbyterian Scots. He fails, but some Scots join his side and fight the parliamentarians, but then they lose this battle, and so it's completely over for Charles I. And like I said before, we have the Peace of Westphalia, which happens right around the same time as the execution of Charles I. And the Peace of Westphalia ends the very bloody 30 Years' War in Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany. And that conflict was also a religious conflict. So you have two religious conflicts happening side by side, the English Civil War and then the 30 Years' War. And this is when you have the trial of Charles I at the start of 1649. The death warrants, this is the actual death warrant, an image of it, for Charles I. And then we have the execution of Charles I on January 30th, 1649. And this ends the second section of this chapter. The third section of this chapter is the Interregnum from 1649 until 1660. And so the start of the Interregnum includes the Rump Parliament appoints a Council of States. This is now the new government of England, and at least for a few years before Cromwell takes control of the country, and this will be renamed as the Commonwealth of England. And so here's the actual text of the establishment of the Commonwealth. In the colonies, you have a pretty famous act called the Maryland Toleration Act, which is for religious tolerance in Maryland. Maryland was originally founded as a Catholic colony, but since Charles I lost and the Catholics don't have that much support by Parliament, the Catholics who run Maryland are afraid that the Puritans, which make up the majority of the colony, will overthrow them. And so they passed the Maryland Toleration Act in order to have some more tolerance for other Christians like the Protestants and the Puritans. An act for prohibiting trade with Barbados, Virginia, Bermuda, and Antigua. So this is passed by Parliament in order to punish the colonies that were the most loyal to Charles I. Barbados, Virginia, and Bermuda and Antigua were royalist colonies, and so Parliament is now punishing the colonies. So the king was punishing the colonies for not being loyal to him, and now Parliament is punishing the colonies that were loyal to the king. And because of this act, Barbados will declare its own independence. So, wow, I wonder if this sounds familiar. And if you read the Barbados Declaration of Independence, which again, all of our documents, you can, all these primary source documents, you can read the original text by clicking on these buttons. And if you read the Barbados Declaration of Independence, it is eerily similar to the Declaration of Independence that we are about to celebrate in a couple of days for the founding of America, for the United States. And so, maybe Thomas Jefferson read the Barbados Declaration of Independence. I'm not sure if we know exactly what he read or what influenced his writing, but it is pretty similar to the U.S. Declaration of Independence. So again, history doesn't repeat, but it does certainly rhyme. And then, as I mentioned, The Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. This gets published sometime in April of in 1651. This is during the Interregnum, and he is advocating for maybe not a monarch, not an absolute monarchy like Charles I, but he is wanting more executive authority under a single person, which this happens a couple years before the establishment of the Protectorate. So this might have an influence on Cromwell. Charles II will invade England with a Scottish army, trying to take back the throne. And at the Battle of Worcester, Oliver Cromwell will defeat Charles II, forcing Charles II into exile. And here is an important act. This is the Navigation Act of 1651, and this act will regulate England's international trade, especially trade with its colonies, and this will be the first of many acts that will eventually be enforced. It wasn't really enforced at this time, but eventually will be enforced during the imperial crisis with the U.S., what would become the United States, the English colonies in North America. Oliver Cromwell, maybe influenced by Thomas Hobbes, probably not, will dissolve the Rump Parliament, and he will force the Council of State to become an advisory board to himself. And later that year, 1653, Oliver Cromwell will make himself the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. This does not make him a monarch. He is just the sole executive whose office is hereditary. Totally different from a monarch. Totally different. And then you have the Battle of the Severn, which is a battle in Maryland between the Catholic proprietary government versus the Puritan government, fought over control of Maryland. The Puritans won, but Baltimore will be restored to power a few years later. So religious conflict is still very much going on, despite religious tolerance becoming more popular. Here's a Dutch document called the Flushing Remonstrance for the colony of New Netherland, which will become New York. And this is a petition for the Dutch authorities to allow Quakers into the colony and to have the right of religious freedom. So religious freedom is very much a theme of this time period, of this chapter. And, you have the 30 Years' War in England, you have the English Civil War, you have individual colonies fighting for their own religious rights as well and more religious freedom. And so this time period is very much a time of creating religious tolerance. Oliver Cromwell dies only a few years into his protectorate, and his son Richard Cromwell becomes the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Again, it's totally not a monarchy, even though it's the sole executive that's hereditary. And then you have the Rump Parliament gets reinstated because Richard does not know how to govern. And the office of the Lord Protector of Commonwealth is abolished less than a year after Richard becomes the Lord Protector, and the Long Parliament is dissolved, and the Declaration of Breda, a proclamation by Charles II of England, in which he promised a general pardon for crimes committed during the English Civil War and the Interregnum, and for all those who recognize Charles that's Charles II, as the lawful king. And there will also be some religious tolerance. Excuse me. There will also be religious toleration that will become more common in England, and Parliament decides to declare Charles II King of England. So this ends the Interregnum, again from 1649 to 1660. And then we get to the fourth and final section of this chapter. We're just over an hour into the live stream. It's going a lot faster than yesterday. Yesterday we went through chapter 1 of the compendium, and now we're going over chapter 2. And so this is the final section, and this covers the Restoration period from 1660 until 1675. So a 15-year period of history of the royal restoration of Charles II. So Charles II, he lands in England, and on his 30th birthday, he becomes the King of England. Almost immediately, what Charles II does, is he will create a second or a recharter of many colonies. This is the first one, the recharter of Maryland. And you have the Navigation Act of 1660. This will become very important literally 100 years later, when the Navigation Acts of the 1660s will be enforced in the 1760s, and that will lead in part to the American independence war for the Revolution. And you have the Cavalier Parliament, which the Cavaliers are the pro-royalist, pro-Charles II members of Parliament. Here's the Recharter of Virginia. The Corporation Act of 1661, which provided that no person could be legally elected to any office relating to the government of a city or corporation unless he had within the previous 12 months received the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, according to the rites of the Church of England. And so he also commanded to take the oaths of allegiance and oath of supremacy to swear belief in the doctrine of passive obedience and to renounce the solemn league and covenant. In default of these requisites, the election was to be void. So even though you just had this massive conflict for religious toleration, Charles II will start to rein back on religious toleration. And this will eventually lead to the Glorious Revolution, which we will talk about tomorrow, which is in the next chapter. You have the Charter of Connecticut. This is pretty much the rechartering of the alliance between the Connecticut colonies. Before this, Connecticut consisted of multiple colonies. Now it's being reorganized as one colony. The Act of Uniformity reestablished mandatory Anglican worship and use of the Book of Common Prayer. Again, Charles II is now reigning back on religious toleration and all the things that angered the Puritans in the first place. Charles II will marry, and he marries the Portuguese Infanta, and she's a Catholic, and her Catholic influence, similar to the Catholic influence of Maria, the wife of Charles I, angered the Puritans in Parliament. The Catholic wife of Charles II will also anger the Puritans in Parliament. Again, bring Charles II. He is taking back all the religious tolerance promises that he made, and he kicks out 2,000 Puritan ministers from churches for refusing to conform to, let's see, I believe that's the Corporation Act. Yeah, the Corporation Act of 1661. Here's the French. They're establishing their own colonies, like in New France. Here's the Charter of Carolina. This includes all the property of North and South Carolina, but when they were first founded, it was just one colony, just Carolina, named after Charles. Here's Rhode Island's Royal Charter. Again, Rhode Island consisted of multiple colonies that on their own formed a union, but now that union is finalized by a royal charter. Staple Act, which is the Navigation Act of 1663, required European goods bound for the colonies to pass through England first. And so, again, this is more regulation on trade, and 100 years later, this will lead to a lot of animosity and eventually the war for independence for the North American colonies. The Concession and Agreement of New Jersey, the proprietors of the province of New Jersey decided to establish the colony's framework of government and encouraging settlement, and this document guaranteed representative government, protection of property rights, and a degree of religious freedom to Christian settlers. So not universal religious freedom, just Christian religious freedom. Then you have the Conventicle Act, which restricted unauthorized religious gatherings outside of Anglican worship in England. Again, this is Charles II reining back on religious tolerance. So they didn't learn anything. I wonder why history tends to repeat itself, because we don't learn from the past. During this time, the English and the Dutch are at war with each other, and so the English colonies will conquer the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, which will become New York City, and this wall, where it's located, will be torn down, and it will be turned into a street, and that's where we get Wall Street. And so it's interesting to see that this, in New York City, and so it's interesting to see, the original development of the colony, and then how it changes and becomes what it is today. And mostly because of the Dutch surrendering New Netherlands, that begins the Second Anglo-Dutch War. You have the Battle of Lowestoft, which is an English victory over the Dutch. Charter of Carolina. This is the Second Charter of Carolina. 5 Mile Act restricted non-conforming ministers from living near former congregations. So again, Charles II not really living up to religious toleration. Another battle during the Anglo-Dutch War. The Great Fire of London, 1666. Another naval battle. And then the Treaty of Breda, which ends the Second Anglo-Dutch War. And you have Charles II recalling dispensations of Navigation Act. Charles II of England issues a proclamation revoking special dispensations and tightening enforcement of the Navigation Acts, which regulated colonial trade in favor of English shipping and markets. And the measure came in the aftermath of the Second Anglo-Dutch War and reflected renewed efforts to strengthen England's mercantilist system against the Dutch Republic and other commercial rivals. René Robert, Cavalier de la Salle, I know I butchered that, begins the Great Lakes expeditions for the French colonies. the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, Treaty of Madrid, signed by Charles II of England and Charles II of Spain, to normalize relations between England and Spain after decades of intermittent warfare and privateering in the Caribbean and the Americas, thanks to Elizabeth I, recognized English control over Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. England agreed not to take any more Spanish territories. English privateers were to stop raiding Spanish shipping, and the English were given limited rights to trade in Spanish ports. So this will, keep in mind, Charles II of England is married to a Infanta, a princess of Portugal, and Portugal is in union with Spain. And so this will begin the very long process of improving relationship with, between the English and the Spanish. They'll have a couple wars in the next chapter, but the Spanish and the English will start to become more friendly with each other. And by the time of the French and Indian War, even though the Spanish are allied with the French, the Spanish will remain neutral in that war on behalf of the English. And so, it's smart to have it's smart to be friends with nations, with other countries, and not be at war with everyone around you. You have the Declaration of Indulgence, Charles II of England's attempt to extend religious liberty to Protestant nonconformists and Roman Catholics in his realms by suspending the execution of the penal laws that punished recusants of the Church of England. And it was highly controversial, and Sir Orlando Bridgeman, son of a bishop, resigned as Lord Keeper of the Great Seal because he refused to apply the Great Seal to it, regarding it as too generous to Catholics. So, even when Charles II tries to do something that is pro-religious liberty, because this is religious liberty for Catholics, the Puritans, who are still in England, are not going to like this. And so, again, Catholic influence and religious intolerance will lead to the Glorious Revolution that will happen, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Excuse me. We have the Third Anglo-Dutch War, which begins in 1672. There's a battle during that war. You have the Test Act. This act enforced upon all persons filling any office, civil or military or religious, the obligation of taking the oaths of supremacy and allegiance and subscribing to a declaration against transubstantiation, and also of receiving the sacrament within 3 months after admittance to office. So that's even less religious tolerance. And Treaty of Westminster ends the Third Anglo-Dutch War, and I think that's the last time the English and the Dutch will fight each other. Charles II's proclamation on recalling dispensations of Navigation Act, and this just tightens the enforcement of the Navigation Acts. And Charles II's proclamation prohibiting African trade to plantations. So this is an interesting document. Charles II of England, one of the last documents that he signs before the end of this period, is to tighten the Crown's control over colonial commerce by restricting unauthorized trade in enslaved Africans to the English plantations in the Americas. The measure reinforced the mercantilist framework of the Navigation Acts and aimed to ensure that all such trade flowed through regulated English channels rather than foreign or unlicensed merchants. In practice, the proclamation reflected growing imperial regulation of Atlantic labor systems under the restored monarchy, particularly in the Caribbean and mainland colonies governed through proprietary and royal charters. So, this is the last document that we include during the Royal Restoration period. This is not the end of the reign of Charles II. His reign will last another 10 years beyond this, but that we have in the next chapter, chapter 3, called Intercolonial Wars. And so we'll go over this chapter tomorrow on tomorrow's live stream, which covers the years 1675 to 1763. And tomorrow, chapter 3 will be the final chapter of the colonial era. And so these 3 chapters here are the 3 chapters of the colonial era. So let's see, how long has it been? It's been 1 hour and almost 30 minutes. So we got done through this chapter an hour faster than yesterday. That one lasted 2.5 hours, and that just covered chapter 1. And so, thank you for anyone who was here to watch this live stream. I hope you learned something new about our old history, and if you're interested, I'd love to have you guys on the timeline. You guys can ask questions in the comments, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. And what I'm showing you is our website, tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us, and this is the compendium, specifically chapter 2, and it covers the year 1603 to 1675. This is our website, which you can visit and look through the entire compendium, which is it's an interactive library of primary sources and historical events on these timelines that you can use if you're studying a certain period of time. And we are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3. All donations are tax deductible. And if you wish to give monthly, you can become a monthly contributor. Or if you want to just give a larger single donation, a one-time donation, you can email me at mark, M-A-R-K, at tarpeia, TARPEIA.us for information like our EIN and also our address if you're going to send a donation via check. And so, yeah, I mean, this is the second chapter. Tomorrow we're going to cover the third chapter. I hope you guys will be here for that. And again, if you have any questions about history that we were covering during the live streams, please ask the questions in the comments, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. And I hope to see you guys tomorrow. So thank you, and have a nice day.